It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm from the University of Birmingham, Birmingham being Britain's second city, and the youngest and most diverse ethnically and in terms of language, I believe. But let's not be too competitive about these things. So I'm here to look at the nature of financial inclusion within the broader context of the changing labour market and austerity that we've heard of already. I'm going to be looking at some of the trends in access to bank accounts, savings for short-term and long-term credit and debt. So I'll give you quite a lot of figures. We've heard quite a few already. I'll give you a few more. I'll say something about the broader causes and consequences of financial exclusion and then turn to the policy agenda here, what should be done in this area. What I'm going to be talking about is joint work with Stephen McKay at the University of Lincoln, and it's been funded by the Friends Provident Foundation. And some copies of the report are available, or were available in the coffee room, and also you can find the report online. So if I do flick through some of the figures quickly, you can go to the report and get all the detail, and also get in touch with me to find out more about the sources of the data and so on. So first of all, defining financial inclusion. We've talked about it already to some extent, but just to be a bit clear where I'm coming from. Most definitions focus on access to appropriate and affordable financial products and services, things like bank accounts, savings accounts, affordable credit, insurance products, and debt advice, and so on. And I think that's a very clear and quite concise definition that I will certainly be talking to. But others, so for example, people like Elaine Kempson and Sharon Collard, talk about the really the ends. What's the purpose of having access to those forms of financial products and services? And it's because we want people to be able to manage day-to-day transactions, to meet one-off expenses, to manage a loss of earned income, and avoid or reduce problem debt. So sometimes it's better to look at those ends and then think about what are the means to achieve those ends. And the means can be include the role of the welfare state in providing a safety net and levels of income that people can afford to manage. So it has to be hand in hand, I think. The financial services are only part of the story. There's a much broader aspect to all of this, which I will talk about. And there's also a much bigger academic debate, which I know you're just going to really flag up, but a broader debate about the nature of financial inclusion in relation to financialisation in the UK. The UK economy has been quite heavily dependent on financial services in many ways, and that many academics see that as quite problematic. So bringing more people into that system is not always what academics think is a good idea. We should be challenging the nature of that system and the dominance of that system. So if we compare ourselves with other countries like Germany, it has much greater regulation, much lower levels of credit use, and it has been more resilient in terms of the financial crisis. They have much more greater role for manufacturing and so on. And as the Northern Powerhouse always wants to talk about manufacturing as well, I think we need a balanced economy and financial services to play a role, but to look at the precise nature of that role. So it's a much kind of bigger, wider debate about the nature of the economy and society. But I just wanted to flag that up as it's something which comes up a lot in academic discussion. Going back to this, the broader context of labour market change and austerity, just to show you some trends on unemployment. This is going back to 2007 pre-crash, when about 1.6 million, the top line is the overall level of unemployment in the UK, but 1.6 million unemployed. Within almost just 1 year, 1 million people lost their jobs. And that's quite a staggering crash, really, and for those individuals, impact on their finances, over 1 million people. The figure of unemployment maintained around 2.7 million for a number of years until 2013, 14, when it started to come down. So unemployment has come down quite dramatically in the last year or so. It's about 1.9 million in 2014. That's still nearly 2 million people out of work. The lower line is the level of long-term unemployment, so people out of work for at least 1 year. These are people who are actively seeking and available for work, and we now have about 630,000 who've been in that position for more than a year. That's again, not including people who are out of work due to sickness, disability or caring, purely those who are actively seeking and available for work. That's a huge number, and even though we have seen some recovery, we can't underestimate the issues that face those people and families. So unemployment has come down, which is obviously very positive, but the kinds of jobs that people are getting are not necessarily those that enable them to have enough income to make ends meet. And we have an increasing problem, a continuing problem in the UK of what we call underemployment. People who have a job but don't have as many hours work as they would like and are able to do to, again, give them the income that would enable them to manage. So again, a chart showing the trends on this is underemployment. We see a big increase between about 2008 again because of the crash to 2012-13. A lot of the jobs people are getting are part-time, and in 2014 there were just under 3 million people who were in jobs but wanted to work more hours and had the capacity to do that because they wanted to earn more money to make ends meet. That's about 1 in 10 of everyone in work who are underemployed. Interestingly, there's an exactly parallel group of people who say they are overemployed. They would actually like to work fewer hours and they would take less pay to do that, but because of the nature of their job, they can't seem to do that. And we have this real imbalance in the UK in relation to this. It isn't just about the number of hours, it's critically about pay. So we've seen drops in levels of hourly pay in the UK, certainly between 2009 and 2014. So another chart for you. Now, if one of my undergraduates produced this chart, I'd be highly critical because the axis doesn't start on 0 and it really exaggerates the dip. But nevertheless, in 2009, hourly pay was about £12.70. By 2014, it was £11.60. Now, that's controlling for inflation. What was happening was there were pay freezes. Many employers froze pay over that period, but inflation was going up. So actually, pay was doing less for you. You could afford less with your wages. More recently, just in the last year, actually things have got better and real pay has gone up because inflation has gone down. So we're seeing a bit of a turnaround in this most recently, and we're producing a report next year on financial inclusion where hopefully we'll show that in the data. But at the moment we're still seeing a consequence of drops in real pay for many people. And of course, this is average. It's masking differences. People are on higher pay and lower pay. So there are differences across the distribution of pay. So we have an increasing and continuing problem of in-work poverty in the UK. People in jobs, doing the right thing, working, but still struggling. Half of those in poverty in the UK are living in households where someone has a job. So getting a job is no guarantee of avoiding poverty. Many people in work are in poverty. Having said that, most people in work are better off than not being in a job because the level of benefits in this country is incredibly low and getting lower with the cuts that we've seen to the benefit system. So just to give you some figures on this from some research from Loughborough University, they produce this every year. They look at what you would need to achieve a minimum income standard for your family. And it's a measure they've derived by talking to general public about what they see as a minimum income that people need to live on. And then they compare that with the level of means-tested benefits for people out of work, so income support and pension credit specifically. And they show how this varies across years and for different types of family groups. This chart shows that for pensioners, which is the blue chart, pensioners both in 2008, I think it's 2008 and 2015. In 2008, pensioners had as much as they would need, 105% of what they needed to achieve a minimum income standard if they were claiming everything they should on out of work, on pension credits and so on. In 2015, they got 95% of what they needed. So more or less, pensioners, if they were claiming everything they were entitled to, could achieve a minimum income. Other groups out of work on means-tested benefits were getting nowhere near what they needed to achieve that minimum income standard. So for lone parents with a child or a couple with 2 children, in 2008 they were getting about 66% of what they needed. By 2015 that had dropped to nearer to half, 57% of what you needed to get a minimum income standard. If you were a single person without children, you were getting only about 40% in 2015 of what you needed. And again, these were not generous income standards. These were what general public decided was a minimum standard that everyone should be able to achieve. So out-of-work benefits are incredibly low. They're getting cut back further over the years with the different welfare reforms that we've seen. And people are facing very extreme levels of poverty. And I'm sure many of the people in this room know that from their own experience in the work they're doing. The Church of England is doing a great deal of very good work in this field. And we've seen the use of food banks absolutely skyrocket over the last few years. This is the number of people given 3 days emergency food and support by the Trussell Trust. And by 2014-15, it had reached to over 1 million. It's amazing work that this group are doing, but isn't it pretty shameful in many ways that a wealthy country like the UK are giving out emergency food parcels, more than 1 million of them in the last year. It's not surprising, therefore, that many families are struggling to manage in this context, and there's a survey which asks people every year how they are doing in terms of their finances. And again, we show the impact of the economic shock of 2008-9, with this chart showing that in 2009-10, 42% of the population said they were just about getting by or finding things quite or very difficult to manage. 42%. This isn't just a minority, a very small minority at the bottom. People are really finding it difficult to manage their finances because of the levels of income. Okay, that's the context which I've taken a long time to go through, but I think it's really important that we see the context when thinking about these more specific issues around financial inclusion. Let's go to some of those more specific issues around access to financial services. We have seen some progress in terms of access to transactional bank accounts in the UK. This was quite a focus of the Financial Inclusion Task Force when it was operating. So now we see 1.5 million adults in 2012-13 without accounts, but it's much lower than it has been in the past. But some of those are living in households where other people have a bank account, so perhaps can use their partner's account and so have some access to services. Nevertheless, 1 million are living in households with no account at all. The figures that we have for that actually include people who don't answer the question or don't tell us specifically whether or not they do have an account, and that's assuming then they don't. If we just look at those who absolutely positively say, I have no account and no one in my household has an account, we get a figure of about 660,000. Whichever way you cut it, the figures are coming down. More people are getting access to bank accounts, but the issue here is, are those accounts actually working for them? Some people actually have accounts but don't use them. They just draw out their money and then they work in cash because they're concerned about going overdrawn and paying charges. And so although these figures are important to look at, we need to look a bit beneath the surface of this too. In terms of savings accounts, we're seeing a drop in the number of people that have savings accounts because they don't really have enough money to save. They're drawing on their savings to avoid borrowing, to pay off debts and so on. And so we're seeing a fall in the number of people with savings accounts. But of those that have savings or remain with savings, we're seeing an increase in the amount people have. So we're seeing a polarisation, a growing inequality between those of us, many of us maybe, who have ISAs and we have good accounts and we put more money into those, but those at the bottom, a large group of people who cannot afford to save very much at all. So increasing inequality. In terms of pensions, there are some positive trends the last couple of years because of the rollout of auto-enrolment. So if you join a workplace of a certain size, you'll be automatically enrolled into a pension. And by 2017, I think that's meant to cover all employees. So some positive signs there, perhaps, but the issue again here is, are people putting enough into those pensions to really give them a decent level of income on retirement? And how much will they get, given that these pensions are defined contributions pensions and not defined benefits pensions? So it's very difficult to judge what you're going to get at the end of the day. And we're seeing a continual decline in the more generous, perhaps, defined, or at least more secure defined benefits pensions. In relation to access to affordable credit and use of credit, we're seeing, again, people generally trying to not use as much credit as they were in the past, trying to be more cautious, more careful with their money. So a slight drop in use of unsecured credit. But as has been mentioned, between 2006 and 12, there was an increase in payday lending. That has dropped again, as we've heard, but we don't really know too much about what's happened with those people who have turned away from payday lenders. It would have been, I think, very useful if the government had carried out some research. I would say that because I'm a researcher, but to evaluate the impact of these kinds of changes. Have they been positive? What's been the impact on people? Perhaps that research is going on and I'm not aware of it, but I think it would have been useful to do some research and some evaluation of that change. We are seeing more people using credit unions, and the government has put money into obviously the expansion project, but perhaps more is needed there too. And unfortunately, we've also seen a massive cut in support of local welfare assistance. What was the social fund has now been devolved to local authorities. People don't know how to access that. It's incredibly difficult to access it. Local authorities are seeing their budgets cut. And so that really basic form of support which we had in the UK has really more or less disappeared. What does this mean in terms of actual debt problems? We've found in our studies that our data that 10% of those with unsecured credit found it a heavy burden in 2014. That's come down slightly, but it's still a significant number of people. And in terms of the really serious kinds of debts and the impact of those, see mortgage repossessions find a level of about 11,000 in 2014. Again, that's not as high as we might have expected given the crash, and that's partly due to bank forbearance. Banks have been careful not to be too aggressive in tackling arrears and repossessing, and also due to low interest rates too, meaning that homeowners can manage those payments to some extent. But we're not seeing forbearance from landlords, including social landlords, unfortunately, and we're seeing a big increase in evictions from rented property, including social rented properties. Now, again, I can understand the pressures on housing associations and councils, but this is a major issue. If people are evicted from social housing, where do they turn? So those are some of the figures, some of the trends in relation to the broader context and financial services. In terms of what are the causes, well, I've kind of hinted at this really. I think it's very much about low and insecure incomes, both in work and out of work. Incomes out of work have always been low, they're getting lower. They used to be at least fairly secure. If you were on benefits, you roughly knew what you were going to get. And that has changed. The governments have been more aggressive with benefit sanctions, they're increasing benefit delays, and that's been a primary cause of people turning to food banks. So we have great insecurity of income as well as a very low level of income. I think we also need to look at the policies and practices of a whole range of different actors. We've talked about some of those already this morning. We can't let the mainstream banks off the hook here at all. One of the reasons people don't use those mainstream facilities is because the products are not appropriate. The banks are not trying to cater for all groups, and I think there should be more done to make it part of their remit to do that. But where people do use mainstream services like bank accounts, if they go overdrawn, the charges that they often pay are extremely high and actually put them very much in parallel with what we normally call high-cost lenders. So when we talk about high-cost lenders, actually the mainstream banks are often high-cost lenders. It's not just the more alternative providers that have had a lot of focus more recently. In terms of the more traditionally high-cost financial service providers, we have seen reforms there, but there are still other kinds of lenders, the logbook lenders, the rent-to-own services that are provided by people like Bright House and so on, that haven't received as much attention, and I think we do need to look at those. They're both a cause of this as well as a way that we can try to solve it. Regulation, I think we always have to keep an eye on whether that's going far enough or if there are unintended consequences of regulation too. And then there are local authorities, the gas and electricity providers, housing associations, a range of different actors which sometimes cause issues here by the way they provide services. And as well as, I think all these kind of actors can set policies which look appropriate at one level, but it's how those then are implemented on the ground which is also really important. There's a study by Paul Jones at Liverpool John Moores University in relation to people without bank accounts, and although banks are meant to take a range of forms of ID to allow people to open bank accounts, that isn't always translated on the ground in practice by bank account staff, and maybe some of you are aware of this. But
I was asked the other day, literally last week, could I show my driving licence? I have a guy standing in front of the guy, and he asked for my driving licence.
Yeah, I don't know if I can beat that one, but certainly in research by Paul Jones, one of the people he spoke to said, you need a letter from God to get a bank account around here. That's how difficult it is seen to be to get bank accounts. They don't necessarily accept the kinds of identity papers and papers that you need. So what are the consequences? Well, one thing is that we sometimes forget, actually, the poor pay a lot more for services that many of us take for granted. If you use, and this is from research by Save the Children, it's going back a few years, actually, so it'd be good to update this. But prepayment meter fuel costs 10% more than if you pay with a monthly direct debit. So you're actually paying more for some of these facilities. And obviously loans can cost a lot more if you are taking out a loan. And this is looking at equivalent amounts over same duration. A loan from a typical or mainstream credit card company of £500 would cost you £539 over 52 weeks, a kind of standard APR. But if you got that from the Provident Personal Credit, it would cost you £825 over the same period. So a big difference in terms of the amounts. And there are other kinds of examples that they give. There are also real problems that if you don't have a bank account, you can't necessarily get a job because your employer can't pay you, because they'll only pay you into a bank account, and also difficulties in finding accommodation because of paying rent and so on. There's also an impact on health, both physical and mental. I've given a lot of figures, and I just want to give one example, because all these figures, these thousands, if not millions, are at the end of it is a human being and a family that are struggling with many of these. And just to give you one example I came across just in October this year, the Warwickshire Safeguarding Children's Board produced a report following a serious case review into the death of John, that's not his real name, a 10-week-old baby in September 2013. John was a premature infant and he died unexpectedly on the first night of when his family was staying with the extended family after being evicted from their social housing tenancy. John died after he was brought downstairs for a feed and then slept on the sofa with a parent. When the parent woke, John had died. The coroner recorded an open verdict on the death. The verdict was that John did not die as a result of maltreatment. And obviously we can't put this down simply to the eviction or to the debt problems or the actions of the housing association. But the report did call for some areas of learning to be taken forward. And the Housing Association is now going to hold internal case conferences when they are looking at evicting families. So we can't make simplistic assumptions about what's happened in particular cases, but there is an impact of this on children, on very young children. There's an impact on parents of being evicted and having a child die. I mean, these are, at the extreme, in terribly tragic situations to be in. What can we do about all of this? I think we need to tackle the root causes. That's easier said than done, but I think we need to look at the nature of the labour market. It's Living Wage Week. So I'm part of Birmingham Citizens, which campaign about a living wage. So I would like to encourage employers to pay living wages and government to increase its national living wage that it talks about to a real living wage. So I think we need to do more in terms of living wage. We need to look at the nature of the social security safety net because it's no longer providing a safety net. But we also need to look at reform of mainstream banks and alternative providers too. We had the Competition and Markets Authority report a few weeks ago now into the mainstream banks, and there's been some criticism about whether that's gone far enough to provide more competition within that sector. So I'd be interested to hear people's views about that. But there are other alternative lenders, as I've mentioned, that I think we need to regulate and look at a bit more closely. I think we do also need to look at actions from local authorities in relation to local welfare assistance, housing associations in relation to tackling debt problems. Again, I don't underestimate the challenges that are out there for housing associations, but I think we need to think about how we do this better. And money advice. I haven't mentioned money advice. I haven't mentioned financial capability in education because although I would agree it's part of the issue, I really don't think it's the fundamental issue. I do think it is the level of income and the insecurity of income which is causing a lot of the problem. Nevertheless, given situations people are in, the more support they can be given in relation to money and debt advice, the better. And charities like Step Change do a fantastic job, and we need to support them. I'm mentioning savings here because all I've said about people on low incomes and how there's not enough money to go around. Nevertheless, I think we should do more to help people when they can. And many people want to save, and many people do try to save £1 or £2 a week. And we do very little to help them in terms of services, saving schemes, products, incentives to do that. The previous government was going to introduce a Saving Gateway project to match savings for people on low incomes. It was a really great idea, and then the coalition government pulled it within sort of weeks of coming into power. I think there's more we can do, and it's great that Church of England and Lifesavers and so on are trying to help people who want to and feel they can save something each week to build up a bit of a buffer in times of need. Finally, I've kind of drawn on some of the recommendations of the Financial Inclusion Commission. This was an independent commission chaired by Sir Gerard Cooper-Coles, and their ongoing work, they're taking their work forward, and they came up with a whole host of different policy recommendations around financial inclusion, including asking government to take more leadership of this issue and to have a Minister for Financial Health in the Treasury and champions in the different departments. I do think we need more leadership on this in government and as well as in other areas. Somebody mentioned government earlier, and obviously the government is a key actor in all of this. So I would recommend looking at that Financial Inclusion Commission report and trying to engage with their work much further. But I think I'll leave it there and take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad we got it so right in getting the right person to come and set out the issues in a wider frame. So are there any... Well, let's have another minute or two just talking to our neighbour on the table. So there's a question here. Can you just tell us who you are?
Yeah, good morning. My name's Russell Hamlin-Boone. I'm the Chief Executive of the Consumer Finance Association, which some of you may know represents short-term lenders, and we've had quite a lot of discussion about them, popularly known as payday lenders. I thought I'd just add a little answer to your question about what's happening to people who've been turned down for credit with that 68% reduction. We asked people, 1,500 customers who had been turned down because they don't meet the new affordability checks that lenders have to apply. 20% actually said they went to other payday lenders, so that's outside of the members that I represent. 20% went to guarantor lenders, 20% went to logbook lenders, 20% went to home credit, and 20% went to pawnbrokers. That's broadly 20%. It was interesting that 3% actually said they went to an illegal lender and openly admitted that, and only 2% went to credit unions. So I think that while it's important that community finance plays a part in this, we also need to recognise there is a role for commercial providers, and there's also a role for social policy. And I think probably what your presentation there captured both the diversity of people who are in debt and also the diversity of solutions that need to be applied, and we need to be careful that we define those different situations, people who are in benefits, people who are working, and perhaps people who have more difficult issues of vulnerability, and that we don't try to apply a solution, or we can't apply a solution, it's too complex, that is a panacea to all of those.
Thank you. Next question.
Michael Waters, Birmingham, the second city in the country. I work in a debt advice charity associated with our church, and I've become aware over the last month or so that many of my clients are on ESA, Employment Support Allowance, and I've become aware the policy is that they should do work capability assessment within 13 weeks of the claim. I have a client that's been claiming for over 12 months and has only just had the assessment. Now that's worth to him, if he is accepted into the work group, that's worth £29.05 per week additional to his £72.40. So I don't know whether the government is actually, I've got many of these on this case, I don't know whether the government deliberately delaying these, hoping that they'll sneak back into work and therefore they don't have to pay the £29 a week, or whether they're just so incompetent following the failure of Atos that it just isn't working. The question really is, what can I do as a little individual person who's spotted this, as it were, to actually influence in some way and complain and get an answer? What are you doing, government? So this is where there is a benefit, but it's not being paid as it should be.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a question over here. We'll do 4 questions, so... stay ready.
It's Matt Bland from the Association of British Credit Unions. I mean, I just wanted to point out in relation to the Saving Gateway, I guess it's a general point, more of a personal opinion than an ABCL view, I guess I should probably say that first. But I was wondering whether Karen or anyone else had noticed the similarities between the Saving Gateway that you referred to and the Help to Buy ISA that's about to launch, which essentially is the same concept, but helping the middle classes buy their first home, up to £500,000, I think, if you live in London. And just wondered whether there was any reflections you had on that about the priorities of government.
There's a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Pat Clark from Collier Row. My own local authority, Havering, has to make £40 million worth of savings in the next budget year. What sort of action do you think they could take in those circumstances to help the situation?
Right, well, those are really good and very difficult questions. So I think we are faced with hugely difficult questions in the different roles that we play. In terms of short-term lenders, I think obviously they do have a role given where people are, and they were meeting a need and are meeting a need. And taking away a facility is not necessarily dealing with the reason why people have that need. So I think you do have to tackle it from both sides. Having said that, I take the points that Hector Sanz made earlier, that some people are borrowing, perhaps they could go without. That's not a very easy thing to say to people, but I think people and people do kind of look at that and people do go with that, or turn to family or friends in some circumstances. I'm surprised people didn't mention that as a possible alternative. So I think it'd be interesting to see the research and certainly at the University of Birmingham, when we talked to the Financial Conduct Authority about the proposals, we did flag up, where will people go and what will the consequences be, and how can we try to support people that are turned down from lending. I think one thing that I know that Russell's members do is where they do turn someone down, they do direct them to money advice and debt advice charities. So I think that is a helpful thing to do, although not necessarily people in that position at that point to take up that advice. But I think there are other things we can try to do to support people where they are turned down from that form of lending. But I do recognise there's a diversity of need out there. In terms of the employment support allowance and the delays, well, actually the delay you mentioned is terrible to say, but actually relatively short compared to things like personal independence payments, where a very large number, a proportion of people have been waiting 6 months to get their benefits. I mean, it's shocking if you were waiting 6 months to get paid, or, it just wouldn't. Why can the government get away? I just don't understand how the government can get away with not paying people what they're entitled to. And if they are then delayed, they're not paying compensation for any, costs that have been incurred or problems. It is a scandal. What can we do? I think it is just trying to build a community, a coalition to raise these issues, to talk through Citizens Advice Bureau, are quite good at advocating at a larger level. There's an organisation called Turn to Us. I'm sure there are other charities, but trying to get together to really, make this case as strongly as possible and highlight this problem, because it is a scandal. The government gets away with it. And Matt's point about Help to Buy ISA, I haven't looked into details of that too much, but I know when the Saving Gateway was stopped, the government at the time, 2010, obviously in the midst of problems, economic problems and so on, the government said we cannot afford the Saving Gateway. And I can't remember the figures in terms of the millions of pounds it would have cost, but I think it was like 200 million, which is quite a substantial amount. But then they increased the thresholds of tax thresholds for ISAs, which were already on about sort of £3,000 a year, to about 5,000. And the cost for that was far greater than the cost of a Saving Gateway. Now, of course, ISAs are for people, I've got an ISA, and maybe people in this room do, they're very nice for middle class, quite affluent people who can save and tax-free. They do nothing for people who don't pay tax or only want to save a small amount. And I think, again, it's just that irony to say you can't afford to do one thing, and yet you're putting money into savings services, products that benefit already wealthy people. So yes, I think pointing that out again is a useful thing to do. And then I have no idea, I'm afraid, what a local authority can do. I think Birmingham has huge problems financially. I mean, a lot of local authorities do. Birmingham has this problem because they weren't paying equal pay for women for many, many years, and so we've got a backlog of that, as well as all the kind of cuts. And I mean, I don't envy anybody in local authorities trying to work out priorities. so I'm afraid I'm not going to give you any easy answers there, but just sympathy. And I don't know if any other people do in the lunch break can give some ideas. That would be helpful, I think.
Have we got any other questions? There's one over here. I think we just go with 3 this time if we can, because we're...
Bruce Lang, Rotherham Minster. Thank you for the presentation so far. I've been sent to observe and listen at the moment. However, can I raise an issue which hasn't been mentioned for a lot of people on benefits, etc. in this country, which is the access to the internet. Increasingly, people need to have access, yet they become restricted. I'm surprised that's not being covered at all.
Alan Marks, Newcastle, but we don't lay any claim to be anything other than Newcastle. I don't know if there's any research yet available for those people who have been long-term unemployed or on benefits of one kind or other for all kinds of different reasons, maybe vulnerable adults as well, about the new position that they find themselves in with having all their income given to them to manage, especially in a place probably like the North East and other places too, where there's been generational worklessness and not opportunities to get into a situation where you actually get a regular wage and even work out how you use that wage. And are there any indicators yet of what kind of debt problems people are getting into as a consequence of having to pay their own rent and various other utilities and things like that?
Gentleman in the red sweater, in the blue, green, blue. I'm having problems with colours.
Adrian Smith from Salisbury Diocese. Nice in Salisbury, isn't it? It's interesting, our talk has been all about provision of credit, and in fact, credit unions, even the name. I worked for CAP for 7 months and dealing with people in debt situations. And when you're talking about available money, one of the biggest, in fact, a couple that's just recently come out of debt. Suddenly, the one thing they said to me was, "My goodness, what money we've got now!" And it's because they're not paying for yesterday, today. They've got all their money. And it's maybe our credit union, if as a church, we should be putting over a more help with money type sort of, rather than just promoting the idea that you should have access to credit. And I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Hello, I'm Leslie Jones. I'm from Kent, originally from Sunderland, but now in Kent. You mentioned housing and this tragic situation of the child who died. A bit like the knock-on effect from the war on Wonga, what we're now starting to see as a result of the benefits cap, the reduction in housing benefit, we are seeing landlords evicting tenants who are not in work, or refusing to rent to people because they don't have a job and saying, sorry, it's part of my mortgage condition. So that goes back to this wider greater good. And yet the council area they live in have now said, unless you are in the area for 4, 5, sometimes 10 years, you cannot access social housing. Have you come across this in your report? And what do we tell people? We're looking at it with the CAB, but I'd be interested in a wider response. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, very good questions. So digital access to the internet, absolutely, that's an issue. It kind of links in with the second question around universal credit, which I think is where you're coming from there. With universal credit coming down the line, the government is expecting everyone to be able to claim benefits online. So if you don't have digital access, that's obviously a major barrier, a major problem. There's also issues around financial technology more generally in innovation. Not everybody has a smartphone, but people generally have mobile phones, and there there are things you can do, even with quite basic mobile phones, in terms of functionality, which could help to overcome some of these issues. And so I think, again, we need to look at how we're developing those kinds of technologies to be as inclusive as possible. But universal credit is also a problem, as you said, for a range of other reasons. People will get paid monthly in arrears, and so they have to wait that month for their money, which is quite staggering in itself. Or it will go to one person in the household who may or may not share that money in the household. And it will include the rent as well, all to that one person. That's a huge amount to manage, and then to have to make sure the rent gets paid and everything else gets paid. And it isn't what people want, actually, when surveys, both by Department of Work and Pensions and other independent surveys, have asked people, would you like, and people want their rent paid direct. They don't want to have to take that money and take that risk, that responsibility. I pay my mortgage directly out of my bank account. I don't have to take the money and give it in. It's done automatically. Not everyone has that facility, or is nervous about direct debits because of the risk that you then fall into overdraft. So there are real issues about universal credit. It is rolling out slowly, and much more slowly than the government intended. And we will see what happens. But I think there's a lot to be concerned about there in terms of, and I know local authorities, housing associations are concerned about rent arrears going up still further. Point about credit unions, yeah, I mean, it is surprising why they're called credit unions, because they are absolutely for savings, as well as, and in fact you are meant to sort of save first before you borrow, and you don't always have to borrow, and so it's surprising that's the name. I always think back to that lovely film, It's a Wonderful Life. It's all about savings and loans. That's what they talk about. So I kind of wonder why we call them credit unions, not savings and loans, but maybe that doesn't go off the tongue as easily as a credit union. But they absolutely are for savings as well. And then housing. I hadn't heard about this link. I'm not a specialist in housing, I have to say, that you had to be in a certain area for a certain time before you get in. So I hadn't, there certainly is about local welfare assistance. That's what's changed there. With the social fund was a national scheme. You applied to, I think, through sort of job centres, but it was national. Now, if you go to your local council and ask for help, maybe you've come out of care or you've come out of prison, and you go to a flat and you've got nothing in there at all, no white goods, nothing. If you go to your local authority asking for some support, that if you've not been in that area for a certain amount of time, they'll say, well, sorry, no, you're the other council's responsibility. And so this is bringing in, it's almost like going back to the parish relief days, where you had to be part of a parish, and the parish supported you, and I think that's not helpful really in many respects.
I think we're going to have to call an end to it there, because we're over time and I'm being stared at. So thank you very much. Those were very difficult questions as well, weren't they? So thank you very much for being with us.